Today is a very important event in St. Petersburg. And before we start, I wanted to show you a little, little piece. I don't know if you see it on the screen or not from my window. It's a St. Isaac Cathedral. And the reason I wanted to show you is that maybe you recall a story that this cathedral was supposed to be blown up by terrorists. I don't know, ISIS or some other group, Al-Qaeda, I don't know. And US intelligence get the message about it. No, they found out about it. And Trump called Putin and he said that you better watch your cathedral because it's going to be exploded. And well, action were taken and terrorists were caught. Cathedral is safe, as you can see. And I recall when after this happened, now, as you know, I sometimes write for Washington Times. So I bought full page, color page, and thanked President Trump for saving Cathedral, St. Isaac. This was maybe a couple of years ago. Actually, interesting that some people in Washington criticized Trump. This is, you know, I don't even know how to find the words for that. That criticized Trump for warning Putin that his cathedral is going to be blown up. It shows, you can find easily this, you know, all the story. But anyway, let's go back to business. And today, this St. Petersburg Economic Forum, it's more or less like, you know, they compete, or I don't know, it's like parallel to Davos. It's called Russian Davos. It's really huge thing. I don't know how many, like 5,000 participants, actually a lot of Americans here as well. Many panels and all that. So it's just, it's really huge. I don't know if it's comparable to Davos, but definitely in line. Now, so now I was asked to bring some experts to talk about panel today. Actually, it's first day, so it's a little hectic and still things. You know, actually, I'm not even allowed. People are not allowed in the main hall because everyone has to pass a test, PCR test. So people today are arriving. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow because we are waiting for the results. So if this is my, you see my badge, but this badge is not validated yet. I got the badge. It's a really beautiful badge, but this badge will be validated only after my test, COVID test, will come negative. All this is done, of course, online. So I don't have to go anywhere. And my badge will be you know, validated automatically as soon as my hopefully negative COVID test will enter the system. So tomorrow is pretty hectic because I think Putin is supposed to open and many people arrived today and everyone passed through the test. I don't know how fast they can no, get the results. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's not. My results are not in yet. I just checked, so that's why I'm doing this from my hotel because I'm not allowed in. But hopefully tomorrow I can no, they will let me in, and God help me that my COVID test is negative. I feel good, you know, and actually I got vaccination, so maybe everything will be okay. Anyway, it's enough for kind of a talk, and I just simply wanted to talk and to see if Anatol join us. But let me, the theme today, we're going to talk about the summit, of course. It's exactly 2 weeks from today. Today is June 2. Summit is June 16, exactly 2 weeks from today. And news are not good. Actually, there's some comments coming up that maybe at the last minute something happened and summit will be canceled. We know this happened in the past when Trump wanted to have summit with Putin in Argentina. And at the last minute, summit was canceled because there was an accident. Some say that it was provocation, that Ukrainian ship tried to penetrate Azov Sea without clearance with Russian guards. And this is a rule because there were some threats that someone wants to explode this bridge. We're talking about Crimean bridge. So usually when any ship can go through, anyone, American, British, any ship can go through to Azov Sea, but it has to be accompanied by a Russian navigator and just to show where to go, because it's a bridge. You have to cross through the bridge, what do you call the stands, right? But they decided to cross anyway, and they were caught by Russian guards, and the result was a huge scandal, and summit was canceled. The reason I'm saying this because messages are coming all the time. For example, just today or last time, last night, there was a group of Republicans in Congress who demanded that Biden changes his mind and imposes sanctions on Nord Stream 2. No one knows. I kind of doubt that Biden will do that, but pressure is mounting. US media is full with things. Now it looks like Biden is called Putin agent because he first of all decided not to sanction Nord Stream 2, and actually because he has this summit in the first place. So let me stop this warm up. It was kind of a warm up, and the main theme is what we should expect. Let's hope and pray that the summit will take place. And let's not worry about at this time, today at least, for all kind of things which can, cancel it, disrupt it. Let's say that they'll meet. Now, what's next? So it's open. Agenda is open. So let's do this but I want to give the turn for people who responded first. And so those who responded first time, first serve. First gentleman who responded was Glenn Diesen. Glenn is speaking with us from Norway. So he is probably a good friend of Stoltenberg. Stoltenberg is somewhere around, not too far. So maybe Glenn knows something, maybe a message from Stoltenberg. But Glenn, let's see this, maybe like 10-15 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have some Q&A. Because the system is, because we were supposed to do it just exactly from the Congress Hall, but because of the COVID restrictions, we couldn't, and that's why the technique, we have to do it through our own own Zoom, and which is not as sophisticated as Congress. But anyway, whatever we say, it will be still recorded, and we will transfer this to the St. Pete Forum. So no, you will be heard. So please, Glenn, go ahead and let's give us some good news about summit, what we can expect.
Thank you, Edward. Well, I wanted to, instead of focusing on the topics that would be covered and what to expect from them, I want to look at the topics that should not be covered in this Putin-Biden summit, as it would be expected to derail relations further. So I argue that the summit should avoid topics related to human rights and democracy, as this belongs to the domestic affairs. Now, I'm saying it because Biden already made a big point that he wanted to take advantage of the upcoming meeting to pressure Putin about human rights and democracy, with a key issue then likely being Navalny in that case. Now, however, Russia at the same time is becoming increasingly reluctant to include human rights and democracy from the list of acceptable topics on the agenda of discussion in international security discourse, and for good reasons as well. So if Biden pushes these issues, it's a good chance he wouldn't achieve anything. It could be extremely counterproductive in terms of developing pragmatic relations to resolve issues of mutual interest. And if it's taken to the extreme, it could also create incentives simply for Moscow not to participate in the summit altogether. Now, the reason why Russia doesn't want to discuss human rights and democracy at the summit is because these topics are to some extent designed to promote sovereign inequality. So simply put, the US wouldn't accept interference into its domestic affairs, and neither would Russia. So it doesn't really matter if the human rights agenda is well-intentioned or a cynical effort to carve out a space of exceptionalism, so exempted from international law. What is important, though, is that the subsequent sovereign inequality is pretty much undeniable, and it's therefore not an acceptable format to organize bilateral relations. Now, it should be noted that human rights were first introduced then as a topic for international security discourse in the Helsinki Agreement of 1975 for the purpose of cooperation in the pan-European space. Now, at this time, the Helsinki courts made it very explicit that human rights would be organized within the framework of sovereign equality, which was the first point between the two equals. Now, after the Cold War, we see that the foundational idea of sovereign equality in the Helsinki Accords has to some extent been corrupted, as human rights is now largely instrumental to advance what is seen to be sovereign inequality. So the human resources focus enables the US to a large extent to act as a self-appointed custodian of the world, in which it can develop the rules, pass judgment, and also expect then Russia to seek its approval. Now, one can ask, how did this happen? Because human rights were introduced or intended to be a positive-sum game as a shared value in a shared European security architecture governed by international law. But instead, in a divided Europe, we see it becomes an instrument for one side to police the other, again, for external governance. Now, under this condition, human rights entails sovereign equality, and it has a tendency to undermine international law, understood as mutual constraints, as opposed to sovereign inequality. Now, the force of this is that the human rights focus structures not the relations between two equals, but instead a subject-object relationship. Now, currently, human rights implies, to a large extent, the monopolization of political subjectivity, while it demotes Russia to a political object. So a political subject legitimately do things, makes the decisions, and the political objects have things done to them or must passively abide by the decisions. So the role of Russia in Europe has thus been diminished to adopting values as they are defined by the West, which is effectively the role which Russia is increasingly rejecting. Now, again, both NATO and the European Union as the main institutions for representing the New Europe have been very explicit about this subject-object division, as both of these institutions define themselves by their intended socializing role, and Russia largely as the socializing object or civilizing object. And the West here becomes the teacher, and Russia largely the eternal student, as to a large extent Russia can never graduate, as it entails restoring political subjectivity and equal representation in European institutions. So in other words, the human rights often is seen by Russia then to be a tool to make Russia responsible for its own exclusion, which is again why it does not want it to have a place at this summit. Now, and there is some good arguments behind this, because in the West, we no longer speak of the need to make compromises to address the zero-sum structures caused by these enduring dividing lines on the European continent, which has largely been a key cause of the Ukrainian conflict. Instead, we see that most, if not all, interests are framed as values. So we speak of how the West can make Russia do as it's told, and this demonstrates that power and the values can't really be decoupled, which is at the heart of the problem. Now, in this teacher-student framework that perpetuates sovereign inequality, it's now also very deeply embedded into the language. So again, in our discourse, instead of referring to Russian policy, we often see that Washington refers to Russian behavior, and this behavior must then be modified with rewards or punishment, which is why the US approach to Russia often consists of ultimatums and sanctions, as opposed to harmonizing interests to align policies. And again, this is also then seen to be related back to the human rights agenda. And this also creates the so-called values-based system, which legitimizes the sovereign inequality. Because Western powers often gain legitimacy through this agenda to breach sovereignty, while Russia has no legitimate influence beyond its own borders under the same human rights agenda. So any Western interference in Russia is therefore deemed to be good for democracy, while Russian interference in the West is deemed to be an attack on democracy. So we therefore see that the West may instigate coups under the label of democratic revolutions, while similar actions by Russia would then be considered an act of war. We also see that, again, something that also bothers Moscow increasingly is that the West can launch wars labeled humanitarian interventions that even goes against or without a UN mandate, while Russian use of force is always deemed illegitimate, even in Syria. Now, the West therefore could take Kosovo from Serbia, but Crimea could not secede from Ukraine. So under these conditions, under the sovereign inequality, we see that international law becomes diminished as legitimacy is decoupled from legality. And therefore, we often see that in Moscow, they dismiss it when human rights become treated as a hegemonic norm. So under this human rights ideology linked to sovereign inequality, it could be considered to be a product of the unipolar order that followed the Cold War. And now that the world enters multipolarity, there's a need to renegotiate this format for a partnership, which is why also we see increasingly that Russia will be less willing to accept this to be on the agenda of summits. Now, and I think the example with the EU demonstrated how Moscow is willing to show the EU to the door if they would effectively use these summits as an opportunity to lecture Russia as opposed to establishing this partnership between two equals. So, and therefore, if human rights can't exist within the framework of sovereign equality as stipulated in the Helsinki Accords, then the sentiment is increasingly that it shouldn't have a place in the international discourse either. So, and another concern for including this into the summit will be that it tends to tear away at international law. So human rights, again, was supposed to add another layer to international law. It's a positive sum game, but instead we see that it undermines some aspects of international law. Indeed, we often see that Washington now speaks less about international law and instead refers increasingly to the so-called rules-based international order. Now, this sounds like a similar term, but it's distinctively different, as it includes human rights as an hegemonic norm, and thus international law does no longer provide mutual constraints. And rather, it is seen then to safeguard US sovereignty, but limits Russian sovereignty. So again, if rules and laws are not equally applied, then the sentiment is that they are not actual rules and laws. And under this rules-based international order, it's also feared that it's not really possible to actually do what this purpose of the summit is, which is to cooperate and resolve conflicts, because if conflicts are recognized to derive from competing interests in a divided Europe, then one could assume that peace could be achieved through mutual recognition of interest and also compromise. However, when the interests are consistently framed only as good versus bad values, then we see that compromise is usually portrayed as tantamount to appeasement and surrender, and instead peace is achieved then through containment or victory, as compromise is not acceptable. So I think that's why it underpins this concern about including it into the summit agenda, because it appears that the meeting proposed by Biden might not be able to address the underlying zero-sum structures in Europe, which would be required for durable stability. Instead, it seems that it could be designed simply have a superficial function, so temporary ceasefire, while, for example, the US focus on China, or simply to reorganize, as Washington may have overplayed its hand in Ukraine. Now, also by framing these policy disagreements as a conflict between good or bad values, this idea that being tough on Russia largely becomes a condition for political legitimacy in Washington, which then results in foreign policy to some extent being dictated by domestic factors. So, I just want to conclude that I think it's important as they try to work out what role values should have and the role of democracy and human rights in international security discourse. As again, it can't be separated from power relations, international law, or this concept of sovereign inequality. So there needs to be a possibility to discuss this issue. And also, I think at the moment, it will be Russia's definitely pushing back at allowing this to become a key focus of the summit, in which it would be expected not to go anywhere. And because, sorry?
No, it's okay. I think we got the message that, what happened maybe a couple of days ago is that Biden contradicted everything what you said, almost everything. He said that he's going to raise this issue of human rights as a top priority. Exactly. And if he does it, it's more or less will probably repeat the scene when Anthony Blinken had with Chinese.
That's exactly what I would expect. I heard that statement by Biden that this will be the main focus, and that's why I would expect this summit to either not happen or derail, because it's...
So you're pretty pessimistic, because now, since Biden already said it, he can't go back, because he will be immediately accused of being soft, or as I said at the beginning, he actually is now taking place of Trump as Moscow or Putin agent. Okay, Glenn, thank you so much. Let's keep 10 minutes frame so we have enough time also for discussion. The second guy who confirmed participation in this place is Peter Kuznick from Washington, American University. And Peter, is your turn. What do you expect from summit, or what would you want to expect? Unmute. You have to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I started to say what I would like to happen and what I expect to happen are two very different things. You turn on the news in the United States today, the lead story is about ransomware and hacks, and they're all going on from Russia, whether it's energy or it's now beef and food supplies, or the USAID. Everything is being traced back to Russia right now. And if it's not about the ransomware and the hacks, then it's about Lukashenko. And if it's not about Lukashenko, it's about Navalny. So this summit is taking place in a very difficult, fraught environment. And when I think back to the history of previous summits, and potential summits, I'm very worried that there's even a chance that this summit won't happen at all. I think back to 1959, when Eisenhower and Khrushchev were looking forward to a summit and were really hoping to make some progress. And then Francis Gary Powers' U-2 plane gets shot down over Russia, and that summit is effectively sabotaged. I think back to 1961, when Kennedy and Khrushchev met in Vienna, and there were great hopes until the Bay of Pigs operation happened. And that summit turned out to be a disaster. And Khrushchev, thinking that Kennedy was young and naive, and they didn't even have the backbone to send in the forces to back up the Bay of Pigs invaders, Khrushchev treats him contemptuously at that summit. And what is Kennedy's response? Kennedy's response was, well, if he's going to treat me like that, if he's going to rub my nose in the dirt, this is going to be a long, cold winter. And what does the U.S. do in response? We call up more troops, increase the defense budget, leads to the crisis in Berlin in the summer of '61, and then a steady downward path leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So these summits, when they fail, can have serious consequences. In a more positive way, of course, we look to the Geneva Summit of 1985, when after very tense years between the United States and Russia under Reagan in the early years of the 1980s, then they, with Gorbachev now in power, they have a very, very positive summit. So, and it leads to 3 more summits between them, and the INF Treaty, and at Reykjavik, almost eliminating nuclear weapons. So a positive summit can be very, very good, but a negative summit can be have unfortunate consequences. The context now within which is taking place is that both countries are sending mixed signals. Both countries are downplaying expectations. And I look at the United States at the pressure that Biden is under. First of all, it's not clear why at this point, when relations between the 2 countries were so bad, that Biden even called for this summit. I mean, so that's the first thing we have to figure out. What is Biden's agenda? What are we hoping to achieve? Secondly, I look at the pressure that Biden's under, both from his own party and from the Republican Party and from the media and from the so-called experts. Biden is being attacked, Ed, as you said, for being soft on Putin now, a Putin apologist, a replay of Trump 2 at his worst. So they're putting pressure on Biden to make a big issue out of human rights that Glenn was talking about, in a way that if Biden doesn't do that, then he's going to be crucified here in the United States. So Biden is going to go there having to look tough. Now, we know what happens when the United States tries to act like the hegemon. That's what happened in Anchorage. When Yang Jiechi, first Blinken gets up there for 2.5 minutes and goes through the list of condemnations of China for all of China's sins. And then how does the Chinese respond? Not in the way they would have responded. Yang Jiechi gets there and says, basically, who the fuck do you think you are talking to China like that now? He says, you can't talk to us from a position of strength or a position of moral authority. Look what's happening in your country. Look what your track record is. Look at your invasion of Afghanistan, your invasion of Iraq, your invasion of Libya, your timber sycamore in Syria. Yeah, I mean, it goes through the whole list for 16.5 minutes. And it's very instructive in some ways that Russia and China issued a joint statement after that. And they said the United States needs to, quote, reflect on the damage it has done to global peace and development in recent years, halt unilateral bullying, stop meddling in other countries' domestic affairs, and stop forming small circles to seek bloc confrontation. It seems that Blinken learned something from that, because when he met with Lavrov, he was taking a very, very different tone, a much more positive, constructive, respectful tone. not trying to lecture them from this position of moral authority, which the United States had assumed. We mentioned back, I think Glenn mentioned about this idea of unipolarities we all talk about. Well, when Krauthammer first called this the unipolar moment in 1990, he said it might last for 30 or 40 years. Then in 2002, he doubles down on that, says that this is not, I was wrong in 1990, he says this is not the unipolar moment, it's the unipolar era, and it's going to last indefinitely into the future. And that was after the invasion of Afghanistan, but before the invasion of Iraq. Then when things go haywire in Iraq in 2006, he acknowledges that he was wrong, that American unipolarity is coming to an end. And that's the way the world has changed. But if we look at the tensions now, the recent tension over Ukraine, how close we came to a military confrontation over Ukraine after Zelensky's aggressive posturing in Ukraine, and Putin responds, not in the way maybe he would have responded before, but now in this era of closer Chinese-Russian ties, of Russia greatly expanded military capabilities. As Putin said in his March 1st, 2018 State of the Nation address, Russia has now developed 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent American missile defense. Things have changed. China economically, Russia militarily, and that's made the world that much more dangerous because these countries are not accepting this idea of American unipolarity, which puts the United States in a position of having to act and sound tougher than before. And so we've got the United States confronting China in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits. We've got this tension around Ukraine. We've got Russia announcing 20 more military units that it's going to be building up in western part of the country. I mean, all of these situations, NATO expansion, war games, we're in a very dangerous situation. And more American military officials have been talking about the possibility of nuclear war in the short-term future than I've heard in decades. And so I think we're in a very, very dangerous situation. Can we make progress at this? Ed, tell me how much more time I have because I'm not keeping track. I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Yeah. Keep going because we need some positive things. So,
okay, let me say a couple positive things.
Right.
You know, we face 2 major existential threats. One is climate change, and the other is the nuclear threat. And the United States and Russia need to be talking. And maybe on some level, Biden understands that. Biden, despite the fact that he's been so critical of Russia over the years, Biden, and we can go back to his role in Ukraine, we can go back to his insults of Putin, that Putin doesn't have a soul, that he's a killer. We can go back to his mindset as a longtime Cold Warrior. But we also have to know that Biden opposed the troop buildup in Afghanistan, opposed the U.S. action in Libya, opposed Timber Sycamore in Syria, and has been kind of a mixed bag in terms of his foreign policy views. Maybe Joe Biden, who seems to be a sincerely good human being, really does understand the dangers that have been created, especially in terms of the nuclear arms race and the tensions that, and maybe does sincerely want to ramp that down right now or tamp that down. And that's what I'm hoping. Despite we look at the track record of Blinken and Sullivan and Campbell and Newland and some of the others around him, there's not a lot of grounds for optimism, but Biden himself sees himself as a foreign policy expert, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for many years, and so would like to have a legacy of being a peacemaker. If so, there are many areas in which we have common interests right now. We can look at the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. We can look at the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. We can look at the situation in Syria and Libya and the Middle East. These are all areas in which we have common interests. Cybersecurity, very, very important area that we can begin to work together as Putin has been calling for and to ease some of the tensions there. There's a question of returning the ambassadors to each country. That would be a good step. There's a question of returning the staff at the embassies. That would be a positive step. If we can begin to build trust around some of these smaller issues, then maybe we can begin to develop the possibility of building trust around some of the bigger issues. Now, those are all complicated because in some ways, dealing with climate change is not in Russia's interest economically, that in some ways Russia benefits from global warming with the melting of parts, the possibility of increased agriculture and other benefits that Russia will have from this. But Putin has been committed to climate change. And now with Trump out, the United States is strongly committed to dealing with climate change also. The nuclear front, we've got still more than 1,000 weapons pointed at each other on hair trigger alert. We've got to de-alert those weapons. We've got to have no first use policies. We've got to begin dealing with some of the medium-range missile problems. So there's all kinds of things that can be done positively if the two sides are sincerely committed to trying to do that. And so right now, I don't know, because there are a lot of forces that are pulling us further apart, and there are certain forces of necessity in the world that are pulling us together. And so the world is desperately in need of leadership now. Biden and Putin are in a position to offer that. They also are two people who have veto power over the future existence of life on our planet. Each of them has the capability of effectively ending life on the planet. They are the only two who can do that. So it's absolutely essential that we begin to figure out ways to work together as people in our countries would love to see, and the people the rest of the world would applaud. And so Trump asked Abe to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. I will be happy next year to nominate Biden and Putin for the Nobel Peace Prize instead of Hidankyo, who I usually nominate, the anti-nuclear movement in the survivors in Japan. I'll be happy to nominate Biden and Putin if we can make some progress on these issues.
Thank you, Peter. I think that since we see such a tremendous pressure now on Biden, maybe some he can, when moving towards the summit, some symbolic act like what you mentioned, something, just stop this craziness with diplomats. Because if you want to have, talk about some progress, you need diplomats. This is diplomats that have to do it. And now it's very easy, I think, for Biden will be, I think, Lavrov, offered to simply return diplomats back, and not only, you mentioned ambassadors, not only that, returning diplomats which were expelled on both sides. What about returning Russia's consulate in San Francisco? It's, I don't know, I think from my point of view, it's a violation of international law because this building was bought by Russian government. It belongs to, it's Russian property, and somehow US is taking over this building the same way across Russia House in Washington, D.C. There's a building also bought by Russian, it's Russian property. The trade mission also was taken over. So maybe we should start with this one, and then you'll have more diplomats and we can have more progress. Okay, thank you, Peter. And then the guy who confirmed third on this panel is Martin Sieff. Martin, it's your turn. What do you expect? And give us a little optimism if you can.
I was going to say, to ask a Northern Irishman, Ed, to give optimism on anything is an oxymoron and it's a contradiction in terms. And to add to the problem, the Irish tradition is to look for unnecessary fights and arguments and everything. Unfortunately, I fully agree with the masterful analyses from both Glenn and Peter. Now, I wish I did not, because their conclusions are so disturbing and alarming and pessimistic. They are, of course, absolutely accurate and correct. So what can we look for? There is a little room. I fully agree with Peter's masterful presentation. I'll add a few more points, but these are points which, of course, Glenn and Peter have already pointed out. Is there the potential for progress? There certainly is. does a study of Joe Biden as an individual, as opposed to the reflection of the policy interests of the United States government and interest groups, an important distinction. Does that give us any grounds for qualified hope? A little. Not too many, unfortunately, but a little. Peter made some crucial points that I have observed, and I don't think anybody except us in our different fora, Peter, have pointed out that Joe Biden does have a track record of courageously, usually he will go along with the Senate establishment, such as voting for the Iraq wars. But when he feels strongly and clearly on a subject, he will stand up in the face of the war hawks. It hasn't happened that often, but it has happened strikingly on more than one occasion. He sacrificed a lot of his early credibility at the beginning of the first Obama administration by advising President Obama at that time to pull out of Afghanistan and to take a more soft position on Iraq. Instead, Obama chose to go with the cheap hawkishness and demagoguery of Hillary Clinton. And I maintain to this day, President Obama, most of his domestic appointments I felt were rather good. But his most catastrophic appointment, I believe by far to this day, was appointing Clinton as Secretary of State. And the world is still in chaos from the Middle East through Eastern Europe because of the policies that were unleashed during those first fateful 4 years of the first Obama administration. I think it's a credit to John Kerry that he, again, another basically honorable and well-meaning and responsible feeling man, that he tried as best he could in the face of so many negative forces in the second half of the Obama administration to at least prevent making things worse. But they were already broken and you couldn't put them back together again. As I say, Peter's made the key points here. There is, if one looks at President Biden's areas of interest, the areas where he should be hoped to respond positively to Russian initiatives or to present initiatives in a genuinely consensual and constructive way are clear. They are nuclear issues, and they are Iran, reviving the JCPOA and getting the United States back into it and getting the regime back up and running again. And the third area, as Peter has pointed out, climate change. And these reflect a very important key to the president. He is 78 years old. He is, I believe, with Peter, essentially in person, an honorable and good man. I've covered him for many years. I don't presume to, he should remember me, but whenever I've been in a room with him, it's always been, of course, as one of a multitude, which is the media way in conferences. But I know personally people who have served on his staff over the years, and the pattern is always the same, of a man who is personally decent, caring, moral, honorable, constructive. But he has been in this environment for a very long time. And he is appointed to these key positions, Blinken, Sullivan, the familiar faces, and they are exactly the same people who were around him, of course, in the Obama administration, and this is the key. This is a 78-year-old gentleman who, for reasons both good and bad, we cannot really expect him to change his policies except under deep duress. I believe the Ukraine crisis with Zelensky was a wake-up call for him, a very welcome wake-up call for him, just as the Cuban Missile Crisis was for President Kennedy. But as Peter pointed out, from the ghastly Vienna summit to the near annihilation of the world, or at least the northern hemisphere of it, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, was downhill all the way. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both Kennedy and Khrushchev sobered up dramatically to degrees which appeared inconceivable for people who had watched either of them carefully before. They both were deeply, and we got a whole new era of nuclear restraint and control out of that. That basically gave the world a breathing space for several generations. This all stems directly from the new respect and understanding John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev had for each other and their roles in the world. I think there is real possibility to assume that Joe Biden felt this way after the Ukraine crisis. And there is one other issue, which ironically was launched by Mike Pompeo, of all people, which may, in the short term at least, help improve relations with Russia. And that is Pompeo, who I do believe must have been one of the most dimmest Secretary of States, whatever else negative you may say about him, that we have ever seen, had this extraordinary idea that you could wave a magic wand and all of a sudden you could simply by magic detach Russia from China and play Russia against China, as if the Russians were, and again, this goes back to Glenn's insight, that we look down on the Russians, that we are the elder brother, we are the moral exemplar of the world, that they have no legitimacy or self-respect or credibility except for us. This is existentially not just absurd, and for that matter, repulsive. It's extremely dangerous, not to the Russians and the Chinese, but to us. Of course it's dangerous. But what did Pompeo take from this? He assumed you could wave a magic wand and look at 30 years of non-stop NATO and US-led aggression against Russia and its former allies, rolling Russia's sphere of security back remorselessly, from starting at the Oder River, you could argue even at the Elbe, and not stopping till you were within 4 hours driving distance of St. Petersburg, and we still haven't stopped now, going through Ukraine all the way to the Dnieper, going into Georgia, and as Al Johnson liked to say, you ain't seen nothing yet. And this is continuing. To have credibility with the Russians, we first of all have to stop this onward tide, and we have not done so. And I think, ironically enough, Joe Biden may go down in history as Trump Mark II. A man, unlike Trump, he doesn't bluster. But like Trump, I think Trump does deserve credit for, negatively, Trump appoints all these horrific people around him and then discovers he wants to rein them in. He decides, after all, Bolton's a menace. Well, why didn't he realize that before appointing the lunatic in the first place? Of course, how many decades ago was this obvious to you, Peter? I mean, Bolton and people like that don't exactly hide their inner natures, do they? But he appointed him. And then belatedly, he discovers he surrounded himself with Frankenstein monsters. In Biden's case, in a way, it's worse, because Trump at least belatedly woke up to some of the Frankenstein monsters he so carelessly planted in the Pentagon and the National Security Council, and even in the State Department, as well as, of course, in the intelligence community. Biden is very personal decency, his loyalty to his people he's worked with, will blind him to this. He is not going to turn on Blinken. He is not going to turn on Sullivan. And so he is surrounded by people who are contrary to his own best inner instincts, the better angels of his nature. And he surrounded himself with the worst angels of his nature. And again, as I said before, he's 78 years old. He's a highly intelligent, hugely experienced man, but he's set in his ways. This gives us hope in Iran. It gives us hope on climate change. It even gives us hope on nuclear negotiations. It does not give us hope on NATO expansion. And the one other point I would like to emphasize here before passing over to Herbert is, in addition to the outstanding analysis we've seen from Glenn and Peter, the key areas this summit needs to focus on as an absolute priority are the enormously dangerous situations in Ukraine and Georgia. Georgia and Ukraine are not members of NATO, yet the American media, senior officers in the American armed forces up to the very highest level, act and speak and even testify before Senate and House committees as if Ukraine was a more important member of NATO than Germany or France, let alone the other member NATO nations. We have no treaty commitment to go to war, conventional, let alone nuclear, for Ukraine or for Georgia. But our leadership, politically and military, is brainwashing itself into that mindset. The parallel here is not Britain and France and the guarantee to Poland in 1939, which lacked credibility because of the incompetence of London and Paris governments in years before. The much more frightening parallel is with 1914, when there was an entente, not an alliance, between Britain, France and Russia were closely bound together. Britain was not, but Britain had allowed itself over the previous decade to drift into this dangerous situation of emotional hostility to Germany, against whom there were no fundamental British interests engaged or involved, and a moral obligation to France, because so many British generals and admirals had given France the assurance that British full support in the event of a German invasion would be coming and automatic. And the key figure, ironically enough, in this in Britain in 1914, I think it's worth remembering, was the arch hawk in the British government at the time, the young Winston Churchill, political head of the Royal Navy, who was one of the cabal of only 4 individuals in a supposedly peace-loving liberal government that plunged Britain into a war that ultimately cost the lives or the premature deaths of 1 in 3 of every British male alive between the ages of 18 and 45 over the following 20 years. They either died during the war or they died from long lingering injuries, especially from gas warfare during the war. And yet it was only 4 key individual policymakers made that decision. And it all came from the same kind of strategic ambiguity that we have been eagerly foisting on Ukraine and Georgia ever since, and that 2014, since the Maidan coup, if not before, but certainly since the Maidan coup in Ukraine's case. So ideally, I would like to see, I would pray to see that this issue takes priority. But having said that, one has to finish with a very negative qualification based on what Glenn pointed out. And that is, it is perfectly feasible, if not hugely likely, that President Biden thinks, and certainly I have no doubt that Blinken and other people around him think, that this summit can be used to lecture Putin before the global stage and humiliate Putin and cut him down to size, put him in his place. And let us also remember that the policymakers in the US government still dream of Navalny, who actually would be a much more extreme and unpredictable and dangerous figure if he ever became president of Russia, which I do not believe he ever will. But we completely misread him in the West. And there is all this extraordinary wishful thinking all the way to the top of the intelligence community that Putin is vulnerable, he's out of steam after 20 years, he's on his last legs, the Russian economy is weak. Actually, in many respects, it is extremely robust and strong. Russia is now a food producer and exporter to a greater degree than it has been since before World War I, something you never see commented, a tremendous positive achievement, and positive for the world as well. The populations of Egypt and Indonesia in particular have excellent cause to be thankful that they receive so much grain from Russia. But none of this is ever mentioned, not just in the American media, but in serious US intelligence assessments. So that's the problem, that Biden, not just the people around Biden, but Biden himself will look upon this summit as extremely negative. I think the best approach in coming up to the summit would be for President Putin, Mr. Lavrov, and the people around him to nail down with Blinken and with the US presidential staff as best they can that certain issues, indeed, as Glenn said, will not be raised to embarrass Russia, that the summit will be constructed in a way that focuses on areas where constructive progress in key areas benefiting both countries will be done. There is a lot of work that always has to be done before leaders meet in summit meetings. That's where we should go with this. And if the Russians come to the conclusion that that's not going to happen, that all the Americans are looking for is an Anchorage Part 2, then it's better for both the United States and Russia and for the whole world if the summit does not take place at all under those circumstances. I think it was Tacitus who said, better the Emperor Tiberius than rule by a committee. In this case, better no summit than a summit that is doomed to fail before and structured to fail before it starts. So I think we still have 2 weeks to go to structure the summit to give it at least a probability of constructive progress. But this has to be done.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Thank you. It's before turning to Herb, I know if, I'm pretty sure all of you noticed a statement by Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley. He was speaking at the inauguration of Air Force Academy. He basically said straightforward that we are moving to war and we have to stop it. Now, we know that scholars like us and university professors and journalists kept saying this for a long time. Remember this famous letter of 100 experts that we are sleepwalking in nuclear catastrophe and all that stuff. Sent us some none, said William Perry, but okay, we could dismiss it because they're just scholars, but we are talking about Joint Chief of Staff saying straightforward that there's a great danger of war, and not just war, but nuclear war. So the situation is really tense. So maybe Herb, he will tell us a little bit to calm us down so we can sleep well. Otherwise, Herb, it's your turn. I keep asking for some positive things so far.
No.
Yeah, but this is the reality. Okay, Herb, go ahead.
Well, as much as there is critical thinking in everyone's contribution, and it's laudable in terms of its logical extension, the ground workings, or the ground on the ground, issues are domestic. We're seeing in this relationship between the United States and Russia, particularly posturing and messaging over the last week or two, especially in terms of how that relationship should unfold in the public, but also between the two individuals, in terms of the DNA, in terms of the chemistry, in terms of how they will be able to posture and message. So as we enter this threshold of an event for June 16th, the posturing that had occurred predominantly for Russia's economic interests, and this is the forum we are addressing today, the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. It is about Nord Stream 2. It is withdrawing extraterritorial rights by the United States. It is giving sovereignty and the rights of its allies to decide for themselves what is important for energy security and national security. It is returning what has been a tradition in US-Russian relations with Europe's enormous contribution called détente. Détente is also the framing of Helsinki. And this framework has always been understood that there is an inequality between the players. The idea, however, is that the leveraging framework for all the constellations, posturing, messages, and is based on justice. That's the word missing. We have peace and we have security, but the long-term gain is justice. Because the narrative that each of these individuals bring home or bring to the world stage is that we are doing something right for ourselves and the others. If it's called in terms of protecting ourselves from encirclement or deeming the rights of self-determination for others. All these very important words framed under international law, framed under human rights, but more important is under humanitarian law. And that is the vacuum that we are experiencing that is drawing us closer and closer to a nuclear catastrophe.
Yes.
It is humanitarianism for which we are facing in global climate change, in terms of the poverty, in terms of the discrepancy between rich and poor, etc. So everyone in their narrative returns to religion. to booster some security. Because the people, regardless of where they are scared of the changes. It's called a cultural revolution at a time of a forced industrial revolution. We are moving so quickly that even our leaders don't understand what is happening. And it's people like us who are trying to explain the past as well as the future, based on what is going to be a current event in 2 weeks or less. So what is the remedy? What is necessary for the topics in this discussion? The question is, how can we jointly, United States and Russia, with the others, not just us dividing up the world in terms of sphere of interest, the sphere of influence. It is about how we can, as two superpowers which respect each other in this moment, at this event, at this occasion, contribute to a better governance in world affairs. How do we work together to end the conflict in the Caucasus? How do we work together constructively to bring rising powers from Turkey or from other nations in India or any other nations in South America to come to an understanding that just because it's their sovereign borders does not give them an excuse to condemn the world into an irreversible climate change. The Amazonas is not a bargaining chip because it is in Brazil. The effects, the interdependence of world affairs moves beyond what is referred to as sovereign inequality. All nations are sovereign. All nations have the ability to be represented. How do veto power nations share with this responsibility in a governance that will allow them to message and posture an evolution where we can work together. Don't forget the past, you got to keep that. That's not going to happen. But you have to be innovative enough to find ways where it's workable in frameworks that we call justice. Because that's the principle of that governance. The tools are international law, the tools are diplomacy, and all of the aspects of how to balance interests in realpolitik. But what people don't talk enough about is the humanitarianism that we need to seek so that we both as nations and as people can join together in this struggle to help prevent the disasters that we have all discussed this afternoon or this evening. I'll end here.
Ed, we can't hear you.
Yes, I have an idea if maybe on the eve of the summit, like June 14 or maybe in a couple of days, if you have some maybe summary of what you just said today, we can have maybe I sometimes do like a 2-page display, like page 4 and 5 in Washington Times, and we will come up with some specific recommendations, and perhaps Biden will see it. Maybe it will play some role. So each of you said something very important, and if you can, we still have a few days, make a little summary, maybe a couple of paragraphs. What specifically what kind of advice we give Biden on the way to Europe? Who knows? Maybe our voice will be heard. Voices, I would say. things are not going well, and we already talked. I think all of us here. Too bad that Anatol, maybe Anatoly will jump in at the last minute from his farewell dinner. But Anatol is saying his articles are really very good. I read them every day, so maybe we can use some of his statements that he already printed. Let's come up with some kind of advice, so like bon voyage to Biden to Europe, with not just bon voyage, but with some specific message. Maybe, who knows, maybe it will play some role. I think we still have a few minutes left. Maybe someone wants to add a few things, or ask a question of each other, or comment, or agree, disagree. We still have a few minutes.
Well, I thought I was motivated by your call for optimism. I would point out that there is some room for optimism here, because a key problem between Russia and the United States is exactly the problem. There's been so many areas of conflict, and a lot of these are now seemingly coming a little bit to an end. For example, in Syria, this conflict has been in intense standoff, but now that Saudi Arabia is moving towards restoring diplomatic relations with Syria, the Arab League might embrace Syria again, then this conflict might come to an end, which would be good to ease tensions. You have the same in Minsk. For a long time, the US had tried to pressure to renegotiate the Minsk agreement, but now that the option was between the Minsk agreement or war, the US has been leaning more now towards the Minsk agreement anyways. So that kind of solved. There also has been a lot of pressure on the Europeans to go against Nord Stream, but now they kind of recognize it's already done. There's not much we can do. So this is kind of also going off the list or a long list of conflicts. And yes, so and also last, this idea since 2014 that if you just punish Russia enough and negotiate from a position of strength, then Russia will accept some concessions. It seems now that he recognizes that the result has instead been that Russia has begun to pivot to China. So in terms of diversifying its industries, transportation corridors, financial instruments. So this is also becoming a problematic strategy. So I was a little bit optimistic when Biden will argue that the pipeline hack, that Russia could not be blamed for it. Definitely during the last years of Russia gating, and evidence wasn't really that big of an issue, and it would have been pinned on Russia. So there are indications now that a lot of these conflict zones are coming down, which opens up the opportunity for more diplomacy.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, you did mention a few positive things. And I wanted also to mention, because some of you maybe didn't see it, Herb and Peter, they took part in it. It's a very important event happened last week, because the great Russian scientist Andrei Sakharov, actually who was father of H-bomb, and also, of course, great peace and human rights activist, Nobel Prize winner. He was mistreated, of course, in the Soviet days, sent in exile, and of course, he was supported in the West, including President Reagan. We had a ceremony in the White House praising Sakharov. But now, presently, President Putin praised Sakharov. Can you imagine that Sakharov was denounced by the Soviet government and sent in exile? Actually, they called him CIA agent and traitor and all that stuff. President Putin praised Sakharov on his 100th anniversary of his birthday. And there was several ceremonies, including Russian Academy of Science, and different, actually at the same time in the United States as well. So Sakharov is a man who is admired both in the United States and in Russia. His statue was unveiled on my campus, my university where I'm teaching, Russian National Research Nuclear University. And so many dignitaries spoke at this event. Several Nobel laureates. We had also similar session online with Stanford, with Harvard. So this man, which can be like symbol of something which unites United States and Russia. Gorbachev keeps speaking out, and you know, the Gorbachev is very admired in the United States, not so much in Russia, because Russians feel that Gorbachev was fooled. He was naive. He believed that NATO will not expand. So his authority in Russia is not very high, but he's admired in Washington. So those two people, I think, can play some, well, Sakharov, unfortunately, he passed away, but his idea is still alive. I think what's really was remarkable, what was happening a few days ago, and I want to thank Peter and Herb, who stayed, by the way, I mentioned about statue of Sakharov, and just was unveiled in Moscow, but we did this in Washington a long time ago. We have statue of Sakharov, and Peter and Herbert spoke online to us no, from Sakharov statue in Washington. It was a very remarkable thing. Thank you, Peter and Herb. Okay, anyone else wants to add a few lines? And
I'd like to add
sure.
a couple of things. First of all, when I was giving my talk about Sakharov, a garbage truck parked right in front of me on the street and revved its engines. I couldn't even hear myself. I don't know if you were able to hear me, but it was very, very disorienting.
You think it was special? It was a provocation? Someone did it?
I think it was sabotage. I think it was sabotage. I want to compliment everybody on such excellent presentations. If there's any way we can get this panel widely distributed, I think this was, everybody's presentations were just excellent and eye-opening and interesting, provocative. I would love to get this out as widely as possible.
Yeah.
A few comments on each. I agree with Glenn on that there are some positive signs right now. That Nord Stream 2 and accusations on some of the hacking. Biden is doing some positive things right now. I just see he's under enormous pressure. Yes. And it's not so much Biden, it's everybody around him. The media is just awful. And that, you know, publishing things by Kasparov and others, just very, very negative accusations against Biden already. So far as a couple of things that Marty said, I agree with you about Bolton. It was the North Koreans who really nailed him. Yes. It was the North Koreans who called him human scum and a bloodsucker. And I think that was the most apt description of Bolton that I've heard. Yes. You talked about NATO. I was very troubled with Zelensky calling so openly again for Ukraine joining NATO recently. I was glad that he hasn't been invited, the last I heard, to the upcoming NATO meeting. But that's a tinderbox. That's, if the US was crazy enough to actually invite him, I think that would be, there'd be war. I think the Russians would militarily intervene to end that. One of the things that makes me a little optimistic is that the US ambassador, the ambassador in 2008, when George W. Bush called for Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, the US ambassador was Bill Burns, who's now the head of the CIA. And it was Burns who sent that memo back to Washington titled "Niet means Niet." Don't cross Russia's red lines when it comes to Ukraine and NATO. Yes, hopefully he's playing a more positive role. You mentioned that 1 in 3 Brits between the age of 18 and 45 died in World War I.
Or after it, in the longer term.
In the aftermath, actually 1 out of 2 French men
that makes sense.
That age died. 50% of French youth and men died in World War I. It was a horrific war in every regard. Ed, you mentioned about Milley warning about nuclear war. Some of the more recent warnings came from Admiral Richard, the head of Stratcom, who said that nuclear war is really possible within the next 5 years. So we've had a number of top military officials making those warnings. And Herbert's talking about working together. none of us, this is one of Ed's big themes that is constantly bringing before people in the United States and the rest of the world, how we worked together in World War II.
Yes.
And when, and you know, during the war, now the people, especially Americans, have forgotten the role that Russia played in World War II.
Exactly.
But not only Americans, Europeans. So I think it's 17% of Europeans in the latest polling say that Russia made a major contribution to the victory in World War II. And in the United States, the younger generation understands that better than the older generation. But it was in May of 1942 when Roosevelt asked Stalin to send Molotov and a trusted general to Washington, D.C. for those meetings. And there he publicly announced that we're going to open up the second front in Europe before the end of 1942.
Yes.
And the tragedy was we weren't able to open it up until June of 44,
Exactly.
partly because you mentioned Churchill before. Well, Churchill refused to go along with that.
Exactly. Yes,
So instead,
absolutely.
we went to Northern Africa and chased British imperial interests around the Mediterranean.
Exactly.
And, you know, and that's part of what created the crisis at the end of World War II, because the Russians almost single-handedly, in a military sense, defeated the Nazis and had taken Central and Eastern Europe at that point. Anyway, there's so much room for working together, and we all, I think, are very much committed to that and need to bring those lessons again and again to a public that doesn't know that history. When I asked my students, I did an anonymous blind survey and asked them how many Soviets died in World War II. The median answer I got was 100,000, which means they were only off by 27 million. And these are all A students in high school, and now we're in college, and they don't know any of that history. And so it's so desperate that we try to teach them what that history is about so that they can understand what the conflicts are in the world today.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I see Martin raising hand. Martin, want to say a few words?
Yes, just a few in full appreciation and agreement with what Peter said. My wife, as you, I think, know, recall, Ed, is ethnic Russian from New Jersey. The family came over more than 100 years ago. And in fact, it's a military family. They have an impeccable record of service in the US Army in World War II and afterwards. And with that background, with my background, which was originally Russian Jewish before my family unlikely transmuted to Ireland, a century ago too. And with my wife's side, you would expect our kids who are American born and raised to be saturated in Russian and European history. But we were at a dinner table, the dinner table, 2 or 3 years ago, and somehow or other the subject of the Holocaust. And I said, well, you know, of course, who ended the Holocaust. And all our 3 kids are now at university. 2 are going through Ivy League. 1 has completed it. The third, the young lady in question here, got herself into the new School of Social Research in New York City, is doing very well there. So these are all very bright kids, and in conventional terms are superbly well educated. And none of them knew, you know, who had liberated the death camps in Poland. And then our younger girl, Rachel, again, the new school, brilliant new school student, says, but not into history, says casually, oh, I don't know, Daddy. The US, I guess. The US, I guess. Exactly, Peter. I think your point is so important, it cannot be overemphasized sufficiently. There is a total amnesia in the American public. And, you know, it didn't always be this way. I mean, I grew up loving American culture from the depths of Ireland. And I remember when I was a kid in the 1960s, within 2 or 3 years of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets were seen as a much greater existential threat to America than Russia has ever been under President Putin or before him. Even then, in American popular culture, 2 of the most popular heroes and 2 of the most popular television action shows, which are still rebroadcast to this day, Star Trek and The Man from U.N.C.L.E., had Russian heroes. Ensign Chekhov in Star Trek on the USS Enterprise, and of course Ilya Kuryakin, who's played by a very talented British actor who's still going strong today on NCIS, David McCallum. And then it was perfectly acceptable to present in American popular culture Soviet or Russian heroes who were admirable, who were the moral as well as heroic equal of their Western superstars. And for the last 30 years, this would have been inconceivable in American popular culture. And we need to go back and regain what we lost. We really, really need to. So I'm with Peter. I think the rediscovery of history is crucial to our survival as a nation and to the retrieval of sensible and sane and decent policies in coexisting in the world.
Thank you, Martin. Well,
yeah, no, I just want to briefly add on what Marty said. Like, with all the former speakers, that is that remembering the history is quite important, because this misremembering the history does have consequences on current politics. I mean, in this country, in Norway, we especially see it, because whenever there's a reference to World War II and the Russians liberating Europe, the usual comeback is, well, they just replaced one occupation with another. But it's quite a strange thing to say in this country, because the Russians came here, they liberated the northern parts of the country, and then they buried their dead and they went home. So we never had any, the Russians didn't stay, but still we adopted Polish narrative, which is very much pushed through NATO. And,
Exactly.
and we kind of accepted this as, no, this is what the Russians do. They liberate, they don't liberate, they don't leave. But that's completely opposite of what happened to our own history. But again, there's a huge lack of knowledge around the history. So, and it does obviously have a huge implication for how we perceive Russia today.
Thank you, Glenn. Well, thank you, everyone. And I want to end with something that just started with. I think now the picture is clear that you see the St. Isaac Cathedral, which was saved by the United States, actually President Trump. I think it's very symbolic that we started with this. And definitely we recorded the whole thing. We will distribute to all members of course, not only St. Petersburg Forum, but also, of course, put it on our websites. And I have about 20,000 plus mailing lists. So we'll truly try to promote it. And of course, again, I want to remind that if you want to send me a couple of paragraphs, so to be included in the message to Biden on his way to Europe. Thank you, gentlemen. It was a great panel. And
Thank you, Ed.
Okay.
Thank you, Ed.
Maybe we'll meet again after the summit and see what happened.
Hopefully we can celebrate something unexpectedly good.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, everybody.
All right, cheers.